Welcome to Private Fame. Tonight's story is about Johnny Depp. Not the movie star, not the pirate of the Caribbean, but the man sitting in court, watched by millions, trying to take back his name. For years, the headlines told one version. The accusations echoed louder than the truth. But in 2022, everything shifted. For the first time, Johnny spoke, and the world listened. This wasn't just a trial. It was a war for reputation, fought under lights brighter than any film set. So what does it feel like to be judged not by a jury, but by the entire internet? And can telling your story ever undo the damage of being silenced for so long? If you're staying with me tonight, like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time your night begins. There was a time when the name Johnny Depp meant something untouchable, a symbol of cinematic rebellion, a Hollywood outsider who somehow became its biggest star. He wasn't molded by the system, he broke its mold. From his breakout in 21 Jump Street, through the haunting tenderness of Edward Scissorhands, to the swaggering madness of Jack Sparrow, Depp's career was a masterclass in contradiction. Tortured and whimsical, silent and explosive, eternally unpredictable. He lived his roles as if they were extensions of himself, and sometimes they were. But behind the carefully disheveled hair and the rock star nonchalance there was always a shadow, a certain sadness in the eyes, a volatility under the surface. Hollywood adored the mystery. They didn't ask what it cost him to keep performing. And then came Amber. She was young, brilliant, captivating in her own way. A rising star with sharp cheekbones, sharper wit, and a streak of ambition that was unmistakable. They met on the set of The Rum Diary, and what started as on-screen chemistry spilled over into real life. At first, the pairing felt inevitable, the aging rock and roll, romantic, and the beautiful ingenue. But as the years unfolded, it became clear this wasn't a love story. It was a fuse. What followed was a relationship that burned quickly and destructively. Passion turned to chaos. They married briefly, then unraveled in public and private, and eventually in courtrooms. In 2016, Amber filed for divorce and accused Depp of physical abuse. She obtained a restraining order. Paparazzi flooded. Headlines screamed. For many, the verdict was immediate. In the age of Me Too, Depp became a symbol. Another powerful man accused, another career to be questioned. He denied it all. Vehemently. Publicly. He claimed he was the one who had been abused. That he had endured emotional manipulation, physical violence, false accusations. But the narrative had already taken root. Studios dropped him. Roles evaporated. The man who once anchored billion-dollar franchises was now radioactive. For years, he became a pariah in the very town he once ruled. Then came 2022. The defamation trial in Virginia, Depp versus Heard, was never just about one man suing his ex-wife. It became a global event, the most watched court case in the internet age, streamed live, dissected in real time, turned into memes, fan edits, endless TikToks. This wasn't just legal theater, it was cultural warfare. Two narratives colliding, hers and his, survivor versus survivor, victim versus victim. And suddenly the world had front row seats to every accusation, every sob, every sarcastic smile, every shattered detail of a marriage that had become nothing less than mutual destruction. For the first time, Johnny spoke. Day after day, he took the stand and unspooled his version of events. He admitted to substance use, to fighting, to being broken. But he insisted, again and again, that he never hit her, that the real violence came from Amber, that she mocked him, belittled him, struck him. He told stories of bottles thrown, fingers severed, slurs screamed. He didn't plead for pity, he simply laid it bare. And the public, already suspicious of Amber's image, began to lean in. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was real and raw, and the internet devoured it. Heard testified too, with poise, with anger, with pain. She described incidents that sounded horrific. Bruises, threats, suffocation. For a time, The trial teetered. He said, she said. But it was the tone that began to shift things. The way Depp's legal team crafted their strategy. Calm, methodical, detailed. The way Amber's version seemed at times inconsistent. The way social media, ruthless and unfiltered, turned her into a villain overnight. It was unfair in parts, terrifying in others. Abuse, real or perceived, was being turned into entertainment. TikToks mocked her testimony. Live streamers placed bets. Everyone had an opinion. But behind the spectacle, something more complex was unfolding. The public wasn't just picking sides. They were grappling with something deeper. The cracks in the idea that we always know who to believe. The jury ruled in his favor. $10 million in compensatory damages. $5 million in punitive, reduced by law. Amber was awarded $2 million for one part of her counterclaim. But the message was clear. They believed him. Or at least they believed that she had lied. And in doing so, Johnny Depp, the canceled man, became something stranger. The uncanceled. The anti-hero of the post-Me Too era. The one who stood up, risked humiliation, and clawed his way back into public favor, not with a PR tour, but with pain. His reputation didn't return untouched. No one who goes through fire walks out the same. But he emerged as something else entirely. Not just a survivor, not just a comeback, but a symbol of resistance, of complexity, of what it means to live under a microscope and still somehow speak. Because what happened after the trial was perhaps even more revealing than the trial itself. Johnny Depp didn't celebrate. There was no grand tour of interviews, no I told you so, no Hollywood victory lap. He played guitar in a pub in England the night the verdict came down. That was it. A quiet, deliberate contrast to the thunderstorm of media coverage that had just crowned him both vindicated and controversial. But the cultural waves? They kept rising. Depp's win was seen by many not just as personal redemption, but as a challenge to the Me Too movement itself. For his fans, many of them women, it was framed as a win for fairness, for truth, for the idea that men too could be victims, that cancel culture had claimed too many, too fast, with too little care for complexity. For others, it was a dangerous precedent, a moment where a survivor spoke out, got punished for it in front of the world. Amber Heard became a lightning rod. She was mocked mercilessly, dissected meme by meme, with little of the empathy that had once flooded the discourse around survivors. To many, it was justice. To others, it was a public stoning. And in the middle of it, all stood Johnny. He didn't re-enter Hollywood immediately. He didn't chase another franchise. Instead, he leaned into the quieter spaces. Art, music, film festivals in Europe. He starred in Jean du Barry, a French-language historical drama where he played Louis XV. It was a deliberate choice, not a return to blockbuster stardom, but a statement. He didn't need to be back in the way Hollywood expected. He had already rewritten his narrative. Because this wasn't just about whether Johnny Depp was guilty or innocent. It was about what kind of man the world would allow to return. And the truth is, we wanted him back. Not because we knew every detail of the case, but because we had missed something he represented. Vulnerability that didn't ask for pity. Darkness that didn't demand redemption. He wasn't rebranded. He was still flawed, still unpredictable, but he was human. And in a world of polished image management, that alone felt revolutionary. The public's reaction to the trial also revealed a generational shift. The trial wasn't just watched, it was consumed like content. Live-streamed reactions, TikTok edits, Twitter memes. Every eye roll, every smirk, every raised eyebrow became part of a collective narrative being written in real time. This wasn't courtroom drama, this was modern mythology. A trial-turned reality show. And its main character walked out of it a symbol. Not clean, not safe, but powerful. And through it all, Depp never asked to be anyone's hero. That was the strange irony. He told his story. He faced the consequences of his past. He lost almost everything. And then, somehow, in telling it all, without flinching, he regained something more lasting than a franchise. Control over how the world saw him. Maybe not unanimously. Maybe not forever. But enough to breathe again. Because once the courtroom emptied and the headlines cooled, what lingered wasn't just the question of who was right or wrong, it was the cultural aftershock. Johnny Depp's trial had mutated into something bigger than two people and a broken marriage. It became a referendum on modern belief systems. Cancel culture, victimhood, masculinity, justice, and most of all, media. The trial exposed how deeply fractured the public had become over who gets to speak and who gets believed. For years, the conversation around abuse had moved toward validation. Believe all women. But this case cracked open a complicated, unpopular truth. Not every story fits cleanly into that frame. Not every relationship has a single abuser. Not every narrative can survive the glare of public dissection. And when that dissection happens in real time, when a man like Johnny Depp, once adored and then destroyed, is allowed to speak uninterrupted, unfiltered, before a global audience, the fallout changes everything. It changed how the internet operated. Social media wasn't just reporting on the trial, it was the trial. Armchair legal analysts. Viral TikToks analyzing body language. Twitter threads fact-checking live testimony before cross-examination even ended. The court of law blurred into the court of opinion. And Johnny, for all his damage, for all his past chaos, became the symbol of something people were aching for. A flawed man who fought back against erasure. He never claimed to be a saint. That was part of why his side resonated. He walked into that courtroom dragging every piece of his shattered public image behind him. He admitted to the drugs, the drinking, the rage. He didn't flinch when his texts were read aloud. He didn't deny the chaos. He looked at it, sat with it, let the jury and the world decide. And when the world sided with him, it wasn't just about justice, it was about defiance. Millions of people, many who had once stayed silent about cancel culture, about false allegations, about being accused unfairly, saw something in Depp's victory. Not because they had lived his life, but because they knew what it meant to be erased without a chance to explain. For them, Depp wasn't just an actor. He was proof that the tide could turn, that stories could change, that someone once branded guilty without trial could still climb out from underneath it. But it wasn't a clean resurrection. Even now, Johnny Depp walks with the shadow of those years. There are people who will never see him the same way again. Critics who view his return as dangerous, as a signal that abusers can wear charm as armor. Feminist voices warned that the trial would have a chilling effect on survivors, that it made it harder for women to speak out, that it turned real trauma into entertainment. And in many ways, it did. There was pain turned to spectacle, grief turned to gifts. One woman's testimony reduced to a TikTok audio track. That, too, was real. Because this wasn't just a courtroom, it was a mirror. And what it showed us was uncomfortable. How deeply we crave heroes. How easily we tear them down. How ruthlessly we watch them fight to stand back up. Johnny Depp's case didn't end the cancel culture debate. It deepened it. It didn't solve questions of truth and trust. It made them murkier. But it did give voice, dangerous, messy, complicated voice, to someone the world had already decided was finished. And that, in itself, is what made it unforgettable. And so, Johnny Depp withdrew, not into silence, but into sovereignty. After the courtroom closed and the verdict echoed across the internet like a cultural gong, he didn't rush back to the flashing lights of Los Angeles. He didn't sit down with Oprah. He didn't take a victory lap through late-night shows, because that was never his style. Depp's response to public resurrection was exile, voluntary, deliberate, dignified. He returned to Europe, a continent that had always treated him less like a headline and more like an artist. France. Italy, the soft lights of film festivals, the dusty backrooms of recording studios, the privacy of shadows. He toured with Jeff Beck. On stage, guitar slung over his shoulder, he played to sold-out crowds, not as a rock god, but as a man who had survived public dissection and found something more sacred than applause. Freedom. His music, raw and loose, became a kind of therapy. He wasn't singing for the charts, he was reclaiming a voice the world had tried to mute. And the crowds didn't just cheer, they felt it. Every note was a defiance. Every chord was a crack in the wall they'd tried to bury him behind. Meanwhile, Jean Dubarry, his first post-trial film, opened the Cannes Film Festival, and Cannes, the same institution that once shunned scandal like a plague, welcomed him with a 7-minute standing ovation. It was surreal. Here was a man the industry had practically blacklisted, now standing on one of its most hallowed stages, as cameras flashed not in accusation, but celebration. Was it forgiveness? Was it amnesia? Or was it something more complex, the public admitting that maybe, just maybe, it had judged too fast? But this wasn't a fairy tale comeback. Not for Depp. He never claimed to be healed. The ghost didn't leave. The cost of survival wasn't erased by applause. There were years of lost work, friendships fractured, children shielded, personal demons that didn't disappear just because the world changed its mind. Depp wasn't reborn. He was reassembled, piece by jagged piece, slower, older, smarter, still scarred. What makes his story so compelling now isn't that he was right or wrong. It's that he lived through cancellation and didn't come out hollow. He didn't crawl back begging. He didn't launch a PR campaign. He stayed exactly who he was, difficult, damaged, defiant, and let the world decide. And when the world came back, it came back not because he told them to, but because they missed something he offered. Not just a performance, not just charisma, but honesty. Unfiltered, complicated, unapologetic truth. That's what people still respond to. That's why his name trends every time he steps onto a red carpet. Because love him or hate him, Johnny Depp represents something almost extinct in modern fame. A refusal to be manufactured. He's not clean. He's not polished. But he's real. And in a culture so saturated with performance, of virtue, of vulnerability, of image, there's something rebellious about that kind of reality. The trial gave him back his voice, but it also gave the world a question. What do we do with a man who refuses to stay canceled? Hollywood is still figuring that out. Some studios are cautious. Others are quietly opening their doors again. Audiences are louder, more forgiving. His fan base, once dismissed as obsessive, has proven to be relentless, not just in support, but in reshaping the narrative. They didn't just believe in him. They protected him. They fought for him. They made sure he was never fully erased. And Johnny? He seems to understand now that the spotlight is not a home. It's a weapon. One that can illuminate or destroy. So he keeps his distance. He makes art. He paints. He plays music. He acts, but only when it feels right. He's not chasing relevance. He's chasing quiet. That's the new version of success he seems to want. Not dominance, but peace. But his story doesn't end here. Because Depp is now a symbol. And symbols, once born, live long after the man himself retreats. He's the case study in the complexity of modern justice, in the backlash to belief, in the public's hunger for redemption narratives. Whether you see him as a victim, a survivor, a manipulator, or just a deeply flawed human being, one thing is certain. Johnny Depp is no longer just a man. He is a mirror. A reflection of everything we love, hate, forgive, and fear about fame. And as the dust settled around the trial and its seismic wake, it became clear that Johnny Depp had become more than a headline, more than a case study, even more than a man vindicated. He had become an inflection point. Not just for Hollywood, but for the cultural contract between fame and audience, between justice and emotion, between silence and spectacle. And perhaps, most striking of all, was how the industry, usually quick to move on, to distance itself from damaged reputations, began to pause. Executives whispered. Studios watched the numbers. Brands quietly ran tests. Could Depp's face still sell a film? Could his name still pack theaters? The trial had damaged Amber Heard's reputation more severely than anyone expected. She would later lose roles, be dropped from endorsements, fade from the cultural front page. But Depp? He hadn't just survived. He'd walked out of the fire with his fan base expanded. Loud, fierce, global, devoted, that alone sent a message to the system. The audience has more power now than you do. And so, the tone of silence shifted. Where once Hollywood studios tried to get ahead of scandal by instantly distancing themselves, recasting, editing out scenes, issuing apologies, now they were forced to ask, what if the public doesn't agree with us? What if canceling someone before they've spoken backfires? What if, like in Depp's case, the public decides the industry was wrong? Depp's trial marked a quiet end to the era of automatic cancellation. Not the end of consequences, but the end of one-sidedness. Suddenly, it wasn't enough for an accusation to land. People wanted evidence. They wanted the full story. And most of all, they wanted to decide for themselves. The era of top-down morality, dictated by press releases and studio statements, was cracking. That shift rippled into everything. You could feel it in the new language of celebrity apologies. You could see it in how PR teams started coaching clients not just to disappear, but to fight back, carefully. Control the narrative. Tell your story first. If you're going to fall, fall loudly. Fall honestly. It wasn't just about surviving the scandal anymore. It was about reshaping it into something that made you stronger. And Johnny had done that. Not with perfection, but with persistence. With vulnerability. With a quiet rage that never turned violent. He didn't scream. He stayed. Sat through cross-examinations, character assassinations, humiliating details about his finances, his addictions, his broken relationships. And through it all, he never lost the one thing that mattered more than sympathy, his voice. It had been stolen from him once, by the media, by the studios, by the crowd that moved faster than facts. And he had taken it back. That's what people saw. That's what they remembered. Not a man without flaws, but a man who refused to be erased by them. And in the aftermath, his story became a kind of myth for modern masculinity. A complicated one. Not toxic. Not perfect. But broken in a way that made sense. A man who didn't just lose a woman, but lost himself in a system that had never allowed him to grieve, to pause, to heal. And when he tried, he was mocked. When he bled, it wasn't considered real. Until it was. Until it was undeniable, until he sat in a courtroom and laid it all bare. And maybe that's why, years from now, this case won't just be remembered as celebrity drama. It'll be remembered as a cultural exorcism. The moment we stopped pretending our systems of justice were simple. The moment we stopped worshiping clean narratives. The moment we realized that not every villain is a monster. And not every victim is a saint. Johnny Depp didn't save himself by being perfect. He saved himself by refusing to vanish. And in doing so, he became a new kind of figure. Not heroic, not pitied, but possible. Possible to fall, possible to fight, possible to return. Even now, even after everything, he walks with that strange, quiet dignity. Not asking to be adored. Not asking to be understood. Just existing again, on his terms. Because if there's one undeniable truth in all of this, it's that Johnny Depp's trial didn't just happen online. It transformed the internet. It reshaped how we participate in justice. It blurred the line between spectator and juror. For 6 weeks in 2022, TikTok wasn't just an app. It was a courtroom. YouTube wasn't just for vlogs. It was a battleground. Twitter wasn't commentary. It was testimony. The trial didn't air during prime time. It became prime time. Millions of people logged on daily, not just to watch Breakan, but to take sides. To clip, caption, react, interpret, meme. Courtroom footage was chopped into content, context stripped and resold as entertainment. The public didn't wait for summaries. They created them. Amateur body language experts, voice tone analysts, legal experts in their 20s, filming commentary from their bedrooms. Justice became crowdsourced, but there was a cost to that virality. Real trauma, years of it, was edited into 15-second sound bites. Anguish became GIFs. Cross-examinations became trending sounds. There was laughter where there should have been reflection. There was rage where there should have been restraint. And above all, there was certainty, the kind that's dangerous in any justice system, because it felt like a game, a reality show, a moment of mass participation in someone else's pain. And still, there was something deeply human in that obsession. People weren't tuning in just because it was sensational. They were tuning in because it was raw. Because for once, the courtroom wasn't filtered through press conferences or rehearsed statements. We saw faces, trembling hands, eyes that couldn't meet their accusers, smiles that hid grief. These weren't just celebrities. They were people, hurt people, angry people. And the world, starved of authenticity, devoured every second. Johnny, in particular, gave the internet what it craves most: a comeback arc. A man wronged, a man broken, a man misunderstood. And through every testimony, every joke, every viral clip, he stitched himself back into public affection. Not as the young rebel of the 90s, not as Captain Jack, but as a survivor. The kind that doesn't cry on command, the kind that laughs to cope, the kind that doesn't beg for forgiveness but simply says, "Here's what happened. You decide." And the world did. But the cost of that verdict wasn't felt equally. Amber Heard, though awarded partial damages, was effectively erased from public sympathy. She was mocked relentlessly, far beyond reason. She became the face of doubt, a dangerous consequence in a post-Me Too world where women had just begun to be believed. And in many ways, the trial reignited the cultural war that Me Too had tried to resolve. When truth is murky, who do we protect? Whose pain counts more? The fallout was swift. Think pieces flooded the internet. Some celebrated the trial as the beginning of fairness in cancel culture. Others mourned it as the death knell for survivors' voices. And yet, in the center of it all was Depp. Stoic. Quiet, refusing to gloat. Refusing to explain himself any further. Because perhaps he knew that no matter what the jury said, no matter how many fans returned, no matter how many red carpets welcomed him back, he would never be the same man who entered that courtroom. You don't live through public exile and walk out untouched. You don't sit silently while the world calls you a monster and not lose something in the process. There's a hollowness behind his eyes now, a weight to his posture. He's not trying to reclaim the spotlight. He's just trying to own his shadow, and that's why his silence now is more powerful than his voice was during the trial. Because it's not empty, it's intentional. He's telling the world, I told my story, you heard me, and now I'm done performing. But the world isn't done with him. Not yet. Because what Johnny Depp represents now isn't just a man, or even a celebrity. He's become a kind of cultural fault line. He stands at the intersection of everything the modern world is still fighting to reconcile. Fame and privacy, pain and performance, truth and narrative, gender and power, and whether we want to admit it or not, his trial changed the rules of public engagement. Not just in media, not just in Hollywood, but in how we see each other. Before Depp versus Heard, the cultural momentum leaned toward absolute belief, in allegations, in movements, in the moral authority of the accuser. Me Too taught us that systems fail survivors, that silence protects abusers, that speaking out is a revolutionary act, and for many, it was. But Depp's case cracked open an uncomfortable addendum to that truth. Sometimes the roles reverse. Sometimes the man bleeds. Sometimes belief isn't a straight line. It's a circle, a labyrinth, a war between instinct and evidence. And what made his story land the way it did wasn't just his fame. It was his messiness, the vulnerability, the contradictions, the fact that he didn't come to court clean. He came as a recovering addict, a man who had written horrific texts in the depths of despair, a man who had lost control. But he never asked to be seen as perfect, only as human. And that, paradoxically, made him believable. Amber Heard, by contrast, played a role the public had grown used to. The composed, careful, strategic survivor. And yet, she wasn't believed. Not because the facts weren't worthy of concern, they were, but because the narrative wasn't. She didn't bend, she didn't flinch, she didn't reveal cracks in her armor, and in the eyes of millions that made her suspicious, as if pain, to be real, must be ugly and messy and trembling at the edges. The internet, unforgiving and fueled by spectacle, decided she was performing. And once that seed was planted, nothing could undo it. This case wasn't just about justice, it was about performance. And the terrifying realization that in 2022, the more human you look on camera, the more innocent you appear. Truth becomes subjective. Justice becomes aesthetic. The courtroom is no longer a chamber. It's a stage. And Johnny, with his slouch and his sadness and his silent, aging eyes, understood the performance not as manipulation, but as strategy. He wasn't pretending, but he was aware. And what that means for culture, for future trials, for abuse cases, for how we consume human suffering, is enormous. Because now, every high-profile allegation will live in the shadow of Depp v. Heard. Every courtroom will be measured against the template of that trial. Every accuser and every accused will be silently compared to them. Was she sincere, like Amber? Was he calm, like Johnny? Do they have recordings? Did they cry? Were they watchable? We've turned testimony into content. And content, in our world, is currency. But behind all of that, behind the viral clips and fan edits and op-eds, there's still a man, Johnny Depp. Older now, quieter. Not fully back in Hollywood's embrace, but not outcast either. In a strange, surreal middle space, both legend and exile. He plays music. He paints. He walks red carpets with a different energy now. Not arrogance, not triumph. Just relief. Relief that he survived something most people don't. Not because of power, not because of money, but because he refused to disappear. He said, "This is what happened to me." And for once, the world listened. And maybe that's the most important thread left in Johnny Depp's story. Not the court documents, not the verdict, not even the headlines that burned hot for weeks then vanished. But what he left behind in the conversation. Because what he did, maybe without meaning to, was force the world to re-examine one of its most uncomfortable questions. What does male vulnerability really look like in public? For years, society taught men to suffer in silence, to be stoic, unbreakable. And when they weren't, they were mocked, seen as weak. When men cried, it was often weaponized. When they opened up about abuse, it was rarely taken seriously. In the collective imagination, victims had a gender. Pain had a gender. But Depp's trial, strange, theatrical, messy, broke that open. He didn't sit on the witness stand pretending to be the man Hollywood had always wanted him to be. He didn't project masculinity as armor. He showed up as someone deeply fractured, emotional, soft-spoken, not defensive, not performative, just tired. And in that tiredness, millions of men and women saw something familiar. A version of pain that wasn't rehearsed. A kind of sadness that you don't fake. And that changed the lens. People began asking harder questions. Can a man be the one trapped in a toxic relationship? Can he be disbelieved because he doesn't fit the script? Can vulnerability be masculine, not just allowed, but respected? Depp didn't start those questions, but he brought them into the mainstream. Of course, there were, and still are, people who argue that his trial set a dangerous precedent, that it scared survivors, that it created a playbook for abusers to use the court of public opinion as a weapon. And there's truth in that too, because none of this is simple. Real life rarely is. Abuse doesn't always leave visible scars. Victims don't always act like we expect them to. Sometimes the victim and the aggressor trade places in a single argument. Sometimes both people break each other in different ways. That was the heart of Depp and Heard. A story with no clean heroes. And maybe that's why it gripped the world so violently. Because it wasn't about believing him or her. It was about confronting the chaos of relationships we can't easily categorize. It was about watching two people come apart in front of us and realizing, this is more common than we want to admit. Not the celebrity, not the money, but the rage, the miscommunication, the codependency, the spiraling pain that feeds itself until neither person recognizes what they've become. Johnny Depp became the face of that chaos, not because he asked to be, because the world needed someone to represent the cracks. And in the aftermath, as the smoke cleared and the media machine turned toward newer scandals, Depp did what most people never get the chance to do. He disappeared with dignity. No apology tour, no revenge speeches, no social media war. He simply faded into his art, into Europe, into the quiet. That's the real comeback, not the one where you're louder than your critics, the one where you no longer need them. He'll never be Jack Sparrow again. Not really. That character belongs to another era, to a younger man, to a different version of the audience. But Depp, the man, has become something rarer than a pirate, a symbol of endurance, a survivor of fame, of love gone wrong, of trial by media and by jury and by meme. And through it all, he never asked to be perfect. He just asked to be heard. And what lingers now, long after the live stream ended, long after the memes faded and the jurors went home, is the tension that Depp's story exposed in all of us. Our hunger to witness pain and our confusion about what to do with it once it's been served in full, unedited, and uncomfortable. Because the Johnny Depp trial wasn't really about just Johnny Depp. It was about everyone watching. About how the public, bored, exhausted, post-pandemic, plugged in, latched onto something raw and messy and televised, and turned it into something consumable. It was about how easy it is to dehumanize both the accuser and the accused when we turn them into avatars for our own unresolved feelings. And it was about how dangerously seductive it can be to have certainty in a world that doesn't offer any. People chose sides not just based on evidence but identity. Some saw Depp as the symbol of what happens when a man tries to speak in a world that doesn't want to hear him. Others saw Heard as a woman punished for daring to speak out. And both narratives held weight, depending on where you stood, depending on what ghosts you brought with you into that digital courtroom. What made this case even more complex was that it refused to give us an easy ending. Sure, there was a verdict, but the fallout wasn't closure. It was a fracture, a line split down the center of public belief. People who once stood shoulder to shoulder in advocacy began arguing bitterly about what this meant for survivors, for men, for justice, for truth itself. And at the heart of that argument sat Johnny Depp, unmoving, not trying to steer the conversation, not trying to define his legacy, just there. A man who had been chewed up by an industry, by a marriage, by public narrative, and spat out onto a witness stand where he finally told his story without interruption. Whether you believed all of it or not, one thing was undeniable: he needed to say it. And the world, for once, let him. It's easy to forget now, but when Depp filed that lawsuit in Virginia, he had already been written off. He was seen as desperate, done. The Sun case had humiliated him. His reputation was scorched. No studio would touch him. No franchise wanted his name on their posters. And yet, he went forward anyway, risked more damage, more exposure. And in that risk, he found something most actors spend their entire lives chasing: a kind of brutal, irreversible authenticity. He was no longer the man playing someone else. He was himself, with all the rot and scars and softness that entailed. And perhaps that's the most compelling arc of all, that Johnny Depp, the great chameleon of cinema, the shapeshifter of Hollywood, spent decades disappearing into roles, into eyeliner, into madness and magic, only to be remembered most vividly for being entirely, devastatingly human. Now, years after the trial, his career walks a quieter path. He makes independent films. He produces art. He tours. He keeps to himself. There are no declarations of revenge, no loud announcements of a Hollywood return, because maybe he doesn't want that anymore. Maybe he understands something we're only just beginning to learn, that survival isn't always loud, that healing doesn't always need to be proven, and that sometimes walking away, not with triumph, but with truth, is the most radical kind of power a man can have. Because silence, real silence or after a storm like that, isn't emptiness. It's an answer. It's the refusal to keep performing for a world that only half listens. A world that consumes pain like entertainment and then demands an encore. And Johnny Depp's silence after the trial isn't passive. It's purposeful. It's the exhale of a man who spent 6 years watching his name, his face, and his legacy dissolve into narratives he didn't author. There's something almost sacred in how he chose not to capitalize on the aftermath. He didn't write a book. He didn't sign a podcast deal. He didn't sell the rights for a dramatized Netflix series. And in an age where every personal tragedy is monetized, where every scandal becomes a brand opportunity, that restraint was louder than any interview could have been. Because the trial may have cleared his name in court, but it didn't erase what it cost him. There were lost years, lost roles, a career interrupted at its most lucrative and creatively rich stage. But maybe more than all of that, it cost him the version of himself that once believed you could tell the truth and walk away clean. He told the truth, or at least his truth, and walked away changed. The Depp who existed before Amber Heard was golden, erratic, wildly gifted, and protected by a kind of mythic glamour. The Depp who walked out of that courtroom had none of that left. The mythology was broken. The charm, still intact, had been tempered by something heavier: experience, pain, the weight of having seen how quickly the world can turn on you and how slowly it decides to let you come back. And yet, he came back not by force, not with fire, but with stillness. You see it in the way he walks red carpets now, not with swagger, but with quiet gratitude. You see it in how he picks projects, not for scale or profit, but for resonance. You see it in how he talks to fans, with more attention, with softness, with a gaze that carries the memory of what it felt like to be invisible. Because for all his fame, Johnny Depp learned the most brutal truth of modern celebrity. Fame cannot save you from erasure. It can, in fact, make your downfall faster, more theatrical, more devastating. One tweet, one accusation, one misstep, and decades of work vanish in hours. You become the accused, not the artist. You become the problem, not the person. But what Depp did, and why his story matters, is that he didn't just survive the fall. He reclaimed himself, not by proving his perfection, but by owning his flaws. Not by apologizing for being messy, but by being honest about the mess. He forced the world to look at complexity and sit in its discomfort. And in doing so, he carved out something rare in this culture: post-cancellation identity. Not redemption, not a comeback, but a third path where the person doesn't pretend nothing happened and doesn't let it define them either. That's what makes Johnny Depp's story different. It's not just about one man versus one woman. It's about how a broken system, a frenzied media, and a voyeuristic public collided and accidentally created space for someone to tell their truth all the way through, beginning to end, without interruption, without scripting, with pain intact. And the echo of that is still being felt, not just in Hollywood, but in courtrooms, in classrooms, in boardrooms, in bedrooms, in the way men talk about pain now, in the way we question certainty, in the way we watch trials, not as morality plays, but as mirrors. And so, when the last camera shut off and the courtroom door closed behind him, Johnny Depp did not emerge as a triumphant hero, nor as a villain undone. He walked out as something far more real. A man who had been through hell, publicly, brutally, relentlessly, and lived to tell the story on his own terms. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't beg for absolution. He didn't pretend the journey hadn't scorched him. What he did was rarer, quieter, and far more enduring. He reclaimed his narrative. For years, people had written versions of Johnny Depp without his consent. Tabloids called him a monster. Studios treated him like a liability. Strangers made judgments based on headlines and hashtags. But when the moment came to speak, he did. Not with perfect grammar, not with publicist polish, but with the kind of raw, steady pain that you can't fake. He laid his chaos on the table and said, "Here, look, this is who I am, believe it or don't." And that's what shifted everything. Because in a world so obsessed with image, with curated grief and filtered redemption, Johnny Depp gave us something radical, messy truth. He became a symbol, not of innocence, but of endurance, not of justice delivered, but of a man unbroken by the worst things said about him. He will never return to the exact same place in the Hollywood hierarchy, but maybe that's the point. Maybe he doesn't need to. Maybe his new legacy isn't Jack Sparrow or Edward Scissorhands or Sweeney Todd. Maybe his legacy is this: a deeply flawed man who fell all the way down and, when the world said stay down, stood back up anyway. He didn't rise clean. He rose scarred. And in doing so, he gave voice to everyone who's ever been told they couldn't speak, to everyone who was doubted, misread, rewritten, forgotten. Johnny Depp didn't win because he was perfect. He won because when it mattered most, he refused to vanish. And in that refusal, in that quiet, unwavering insistence on being seen, he became more than an actor, more than a case, more than a controversy. He became human. Good night. May your mind find rest, your heart feel light, and your thoughts drift gently into silence. No more noise, no more headlines, just stillness. Sleep well. Breathe deep. You've made it through the day. Now let go. Sweet dreams. And may you fall asleep to the soft, invisible sound of peace, like the quiet crackle of a fire in the distance. Nothing to prove. Nothing to chase. Just you, safe in the dark, and the night holding you gently. The night.